Hi, welcome to Cafe 229. Today we're very happy to at this beautiful monastery, the Chuang Yen Monastery, but more importantly, we are meeting one of the most respected Buddhist scholar, Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi. Hi, Venerable.
Hello, how do you do?
So thank you so much for joining us with our Cafe 229. This monastery, as I mentioned earlier too, is very close to me because this is where I start learning Buddhism and meditation. Back then, I don't see as many, my Western friends are not as interested, but nowadays I see a lot more people are interested in meditation, in mindfulness. So can you tell us a little bit what you think mindfulness is about and what you think is the purpose of it from your perspective?
Yeah, well, first, mindfulness is an integral part of the Buddha's path to liberation, the path to enlightenment, and it comes within the Noble Eightfold Path as the seventh factor of the path. The Buddha calls it right mindfulness, and he speaks about mindfulness as, he actually doesn't formally define mindfulness itself. It seems to be understood by the people that he's speaking to. And originally the word sati, which is the Pali word, meant memory or remembering.
Okay.
But the Buddha used it in a special sense, not remembering the past, but bringing to mind what is occurring in the present.
Okay.
So it's a way of making present certain domains of experience. And so the Buddha in his explanation of mindfulness speaks about four foundations of mindfulness, four domains of experience that are to be brought to awareness. These are the body, which again is explored from different angles, feelings in the sense of the felt tone of experience, and the third are the states of mind, and then the fourth are various groups of phenomena that are organized in accordance with the principles of the Buddha's teaching.
So if I understand correctly, the original purpose of mindfulness is really coming from the right mindfulness. The word sati has a connotation of lucid awareness and a connotation of remembering, but not about the past, but about remembering the presence.
Yeah, remembering to keep the object of awareness in mind, not letting the mind slip away from the object.
Okay, so like a sustaining
exactly,
attention.
Sustaining
attention about different aspects of our experience. Right, our body, our sensations, our mental states, and I guess
different
phenomena.
States of mind.
And what was the, I guess not all our audience are familiar with Buddhism. What's the original intention of this teaching? Like we should sustain our attention to these different aspects of ourselves.
Well, we could say that there are two aims in Buddhist meditation, or two basic systems of Buddhist meditation. One is directed towards samadhi, which means the concentration of the mind, the collecting of the mind, the focusing, the intensive focusing of the mind. And then the other is towards the development of panya or prajna through the practice of insight, seeing into the nature of things. And so mindfulness is call it the preparatory practice for the development of both of these aims of meditation. Initially, the practice of mindfulness helps to collect and concentrate the mind, to unify the scattered mind. And then through mindfulness, one explores the different aspects of experience in order to gain insight into the nature of experience. And that insight is what brings prajna, or wisdom.
So mindfulness is really like a preparatory step to either train your mind to be very focused and still with a strong concentration power, or to gain some kind of insight.
So from one angle, we could call it preparatory, but also mindfulness should continue through all the activities of one's everyday life. And so the Buddha speaks about, in his great discourse on the practice of mindfulness, he says that one maintains mindfulness and clear understanding, clear knowing through all of the little activities of everyday life, from walking, speaking, eating, even going to the toilet. All activities should be done with mindfulness.
So in that sense, being mindful is similar to the Zen tradition, where you should always be present.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's just, I guess, Zen is more the Mahayana approach, but original approach is not far away from that.
Yeah, I think it carries over from early Buddhism right into the Zen practice.
I know you mentioned about insight. So what kind of insights is Buddhism interested in?
Yeah, well, this gets into a rather technical area. But what has to be done is to gain insight into what we call the 3 marks of existence, which means to see into the impermanence of all experience.
Sure.
And then to see into we call it dukkha, the unsatisfactory, defective nature of all of the factors of experience. And then the 3rd characteristic we call anatta, which means non-self, the absence of a substantial core, a true, persisting individual identity that underlies our experience. And through the sustained practice of mindfulness, one comes to see into the impermanence of phenomena. And then through seeing into impermanence, one could see into one roots out or abolishes the clinging to the notion that we have a true, substantial, existent I as the core of our being.
Okay. So I'm Western trained psychologist, and I know when we deal with people who suffer from psychopathology, one of the key reasons why people suffer, it's almost like they're clinging to this strong sense of self. I mean, at least from the clinical perspective, it seems like people are fixated and solidified with some kind of mental image of self and others. So one of the insight from the Buddhist tradition is to challenge this solidification, this revocation of self.
Yeah, though I would say that caution is necessary here. Because what I would say is that in order to successfully practice and develop the insight into non-self, the absence of a metaphysical self, one needs a strong, healthy, ordinary sense of self. If somebody is suffering from severe psychopathology, self-doubt, a lot of internal division, psychotic episodes, or severe neuroses, I'd say that the insight into non-self is they're not ready for that insight.
Okay.
But what they need, if we're going to use Buddhist practices, I would say practices that help to develop a strong sense of, a healthy sense of the ordinary self, the psychological self. Maybe through, not even beginning with meditation, but with developing basic ethical practices, a spirit of generosity, qualities like compassion, loving kindness, to develop some self-esteem. And then when the sense of self starts to get carried away, then it's time to bring in the insight into non-self.
I think what you said was quite important, because in order to understand non-self, it seems like you need to have a very healthy mind to start with.
Exactly. If people, in fact, this has been a problem that has erupted on the American Buddhist scene. Perhaps it even takes place in Asian Buddhist practices. People go into deep practice of insight meditation with coming into it with some degree of mental instability to begin with. And then once they get into deep practice and start to get insights into non-self, it causes their ordinary psychological self to disintegrate, and then they're not able to handle it. So, I mean, I don't want to scare people away from the practice of meditation, but basically you have to have a fairly normal sense of self.
Now, which I think it's important that in the Buddhist tradition, I assume we do have practice that help people to build up a good, healthy sense of self.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So those are some of the practices that I mentioned. Like, in fact, when the Buddha gives a teaching, what he calls the sequential teaching, he doesn't begin with the deep insights or with intensive meditation, but he begins with sort of giving teachings that encourage people to engage in wholesome activities, to bring a sense of inner joy and fulfillment, like the practice of generosity, observing precepts, developing qualities like loving kindness, compassion, helpfulness to others, concern and care for others. And that brings a sense of inner strength and inner stability.
Yeah. No, I think the modern psychology, especially in the realm of positive psychology, they do a lot of research on how things like virtues, compassion, gratitude, or even counting our blessings are all quite important in building a healthy sense of self, which is match very much what you're saying. And only when we have that kind of foundation, then we could start to delve deeper into, I guess, how we construct reality and how we construct the self.
Yeah, exactly.
That make a lot of sense. So how do you feel about the modern mindfulness movement? I know it's getting more popular lately. You know, like when I was young, it's not popular. It was for the past 10 years or so. It's getting really popular. You see like all the celebrities meditating and sports athlete, Google's, business, military.
Yeah, well, what's happened is that I think people who started to practice meditation and mindfulness not coming from a Buddhist background, but coming from other backgrounds, and then they would go to Buddhist meditation retreats in order to learn mindfulness. And then they found that this practice of mindfulness doesn't really, at least in the basic form, doesn't require any kind of religious commitments or any kind of philosophical convictions, but it can bring benefits in many different spheres of activities. And so I think it was initially sort of the initial way in which mindfulness was taken out of its original Buddhist context into the mainstream was through this was John Kabat-Zinn's mindfulness-based, what's it called, stress reduction?
Right. MBSR, yes.
Yeah, so John Kabat-Zinn found that he could use mindfulness to help patients who are suffering from chronic illnesses, particularly severe pain, to be able to deal with their illness and with their pain. And then other people started to see what he was doing, and then they picked up mindfulness and started to apply it to other domains. I think it's being used extensively by psychotherapists,
yes,
particularly called cognitive behavioral psychotherapy.
Yes.
And now we have mindfulness for children in the schools, mindfulness in cooking, mindfulness in gardening. Yeah, so many. So my feeling is that if mindfulness brings benefits to people in these different applications, then so much the better. I'm not a purist who says the mindfulness has to bear the stamp property of Buddhism. Anybody who uses this without the approval of the Buddhist Pope will be subject to a lawsuit. So if people use it and it brings benefits, I'm fine with that. But I think we just have to also keep in mind that there's a difference between these, call them secular applications of mindfulness and the original practice of mindfulness in the framework of the Buddha's teaching.
Of course, I mean, it's a great way to attract people to the Buddhist teaching without being Buddhist, just like yoga. You don't need to be a yogi to practice yoga.
You don't have to be a Hindu to practice.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think you have a good important message is to remind people sort of the original purpose is to develop insight about how we construct the self, but ultimately how the way we construct our reality related to our distress and suffering, dukkha. So I guess one thing I'm interested in is what you think is the challenge of Buddhists nowadays. Like, do you feel that we should attract more people to learn the traditional value, or is that a concern at all in the Buddhist circle?
Yeah, myself personally, I'm not really concerned with drawing people to Buddhism in order for them to be able to officially register as Buddhists, so that when we have surveys of the number of people in the United States who consider themselves Buddhists, our numbers will increase. That's not a particular concern of myself.
Sure.
But in my way of thinking, if people find the Buddha's teaching useful for their lives, for understanding themselves, for their relationships with others, for the way they participate in their various life domains, then I'm all in favor of them coming to learn Buddhism and adopting Buddhism.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. So one of the key teaching, now back to one of the key teaching about the three marks, right? The especially the non-self and impermanence. For our audience who don't know much about the teaching of non-self, what is that really try to teach us? I know it's asking us to sort of examine our view, or as at least the ontological view of the self. But can you say a bit more about non-self?
Yeah, okay. So the way when the Buddha addresses the sort of the key problem that the Buddha's teaching is intended to address is the problem of suffering. Or the word is dukkha, which is translated as suffering, though it has many different dimensions, both the suffering that we face in our everyday life, the day-to-day life, as well as from the Buddha's perspective, the nature of samsara, which is the round of rebirths by which we go from life to life, from birth to death, and then from death to new birth and multiple realms of existence. So the fundamental purpose of the Buddha's teaching is to bring liberation from suffering. And in the Buddha's diagnosis, he finds that sort of the underlying root of suffering is this clinging or grasping to the notion of a truly existent ontological self, a metaphysical self, the idea that at the core of our being, there is a truly existent I, me, myself. And based on that clinging to the notion of self come a multitude of other mental afflictions, insatiable craving for power, position, wealth, and pleasure, conceit and arrogance, discrimination against others, and so forth. And so as the antidote to that view of self, the Buddha teaches us to examine our experience very, very closely, carefully, and precisely through the practice, using mindfulness as the vehicle of practice to develop insight. And one develops insight when mindfulness reaches a very strong level, starting to examine our experience, and we see, instead of there being a self at the core of our experience, what we see is that experience is a flow of, we have the basis is the physical body, which is always undergoing changes from moment to moment. And then what we usually grasp as the self is our mind, but we see that what we call the mind is a process, a flow of different feelings, ideas, perceptions, intentions, and acts. Behind all of that, acts of consciousness, which are constantly arising, standing just for a moment, and then passing.
Yeah.
And so when you get deep insight into this flow of ever-changing mental phenomena, looking for the self, one doesn't find any self behind it.
Yeah.
It's just a process of experience, and the self is just a kind of conceptual construct built upon that flow, that process, and ascribed to it, but without any kind of substantial basis.
Yeah, I know everyone is listening to our conversation. We all deep down inside, we all feel there's something real within us that I know I'm changing everywhere. I know I'm getting older. I know I'm not the same person, but something within me that's not going to change.
That's why it's so hard to.
Right? And like we could conceptually think about it, but
Yeah, but it's not just a matter of conceptual formulation, but this is the point of Buddhist practice, that it's through the practice that one sort of gradually weakens and starts to undermine that conception of self.
mm, it's such an interesting idea. Like the reality is always changing, but we just need something constant to be there.
Yeah.
It's like we're water, but we keep trying to see ourselves as ice in some way.
Yeah.
Right. It's and this habitual tendency is like driving everything.
Yeah. And what's interesting is that when people hear about the teaching of non-self, it brings up a kind of resistance, even a kind of anxiety. But what they don't realize is that the real cause of anxiety is the clinging to the concept of self, not the fact of non-self itself. And so when you get, even without deep insight, but even some degree of understanding of non-self, it helps to weaken, to erode the anxiety that arises out of the sense of self.
Mm-hmm. I know this is such a, I guess for some of our audience, that is such a foreign idea almost. How did you get involved in Buddhism? I'm just interested. I know you grew up in Brooklyn, you study philosophy, but like, how did you actually become interested in Buddhism in the first place?
Yeah, okay, I went to college, let's see, this was the middle 1960s. And at that time, there was, at least in certain circles amongst my contemporaries, a kind of floating interest in Buddhism. It was like one of the things you were supposed to know something about, but I didn't know anything about it. But then just while browsing in a bookshop, I saw some books on Buddhism, so I thought I should be informed about Buddhism. So I just picked up a few books.
Okay.
And then started to read, and then my interest was aroused. And then when I went, in fact, even my interest became quite strong in my senior year of college. Then I went to graduate school. This was I started in 1966 in California, Claremont, California. And then a Buddhist monk from Vietnam came to study at the same university and came to live in the same residence hall where I was living. And so I thought this was my opportunity to start the actual practice of Buddhism. And so I became friends with him, and he became my first Buddhist teacher.
Oh.
And then I learned meditation from him.
Okay.
And then the idea took shape in my mind to become a Buddhist monk myself.
What attracted you the most from the Buddhist tradition back then?
I think it gave a very clear, compelling analysis of the problem of human suffering and practical steps to address that problem of suffering. Not just, like, the subject of my university study was philosophy, but in philosophy we were dealing very much in the realm of ideas. And so I appreciated the philosophical dimension of Buddhism. The ideas were very clear, consistent, rigorous.
Yeah.
But it also gave a practical method to realize these ideas. And these ideas were not just detached from life, but they were ideas about how to transform one's life, to transform one's life in a positive direction. I wasn't at that point thinking about liberation from samsara, but how to live a wholesome, beautiful, uplifting, fulfilling life.
That was what interests you, is that it has a very clear instruction and method.
Yeah.
It's not vague of like, oh, thoughts and prayer will take care of everything.
Yeah.
Which is like, kind of vague. But, but in the Buddhist tradition, there's clear instruction what you can train with our mind.
Yeah. And even before I met that Buddhist teacher from Vietnam, I had tried to do some meditation on my own.
Okay.
I had the impression that you sit down to meditate, you close your eyes, and you do a few rounds of mindful breathing, and then you go into samadhi, deep absorption. It didn't work for me that way. And so I thought, this isn't for me.
Okay.
But then when I met him, then I learned that this is a very gradual, sequential process. It's not a matter of getting quick results. It requires a lot of dedication, patience, and dropping one's expectations and just learning to be satisfied with little steps.
Yeah. And we're very glad that you stick with it and now become a most respected Buddhist scholar of our time. Now, I know when you said that when you first started, you were just interested to sort of deal with your personal life, right? To live a more meaningful, beautiful life. That was what interests you. I know, I guess in 2007, 2008, you wrote an article about a challenge for Buddhists, right? And about how what Westerner are interested in are more like individual liberation, and you think Buddhism is more than just individual liberation. Can you say a little bit more about it?
Yeah, and not only individual liberation in the so-called Hinayana sense, but even, I have to say, the critique extended to the Mahayanas with the universal liberation, but it was all being done is very much in a way of like personal practice, even if people are practicing in a group. But basically the focus of the interest in Buddhism was on meditation and inner development. But I thought it's also important to look at the other side of Buddhism, which emphasizes those qualities like loving kindness and compassion. And so the idea came to me that it's not even enough to develop loving kindness and compassion as personal virtues, inner virtues, but in the conditions of today's world in which we're integrated and interwoven into one world community, we have to, as Buddhists, look out upon the world and see really the massive, devastating amounts of suffering that people are undergoing all around the world, in this country as well, but all around the world. And so I wrote that article, and I didn't give a title to the article because it was just like an editorial, so I just called it editorial. But the publisher, which is the Buddha Dharma magazine, gave it the title, A Challenge to Buddhists. And so the magazine, the article was published in the magazine.
Sure.
And then some of my students, I didn't tell anybody about the article, but some of them read it on their own and then started to have some discussions amongst themselves. And then together we formulated the idea of establishing a Buddhist relief organization to take up that challenge.
The Buddhist Global Relief.
Yeah, we came to call it Buddhist Global Relief. So we established that in 2008.
Which you're kind of the vanguard in engage Buddhism or Buddhism in action.
I wouldn't say that that we're the vanguard, because there's been engaged Buddhism for several decades.
Sure, like Thich Nhat Hanh.
Well, Thich Nhat Hanh, I think, was the one who formulated the idea of engaged Buddhism, but it was spreading actually all over Asia, even maybe beginning in the 1950s with this is Dr. Ambedkar in India with his conversion to Buddhism and converting the Dalits, these so-called untouchables, embraced Buddhism. Then there were movements of the Buddhists in Vietnam in opposition to the dictatorial government that they were facing. Joanna Macy brought a kind of ecological perspective to engage Buddhism. But I say that Buddhist global relief is one way in which we are expressing, I coined the phrase, I call it conscientious compassion.
Okay.
So it's not just compassion as a purely like inward, beautiful, uplifting emotion, but it's compassion joined with a sense of conscience, of taking responsibility for the conditions in the world and being willing to act to transform social, political, economic conditions to alleviate the suffering of those who are exposed to them.
It's quite important, especially our time. So many issues. So many issues. Can you share a little bit about what do you do with the Buddhist Global Relief? What kind of projects?
Yeah, so we started out when we had the initial round of discussions, we thought that we would establish a Buddhist organization that would address all the different social and economic problems that are facing humanity today.
It's a lot.
With about an initial group of about 8 people and with no money in our bank account, we were going to solve all the world's problems. But then we realized that we had to narrow down the mission. And one problem that had been weighing on my mind, maybe because of my years of living in Asia, is the problem of hunger and malnutrition. And so we made the mission of Buddhist Global Relief to provide relief to communities around the world who are suffering from chronic hunger and malnutrition.
Mm-hmm.
And so we started off thinking that the best way to deal with that problem is to support projects that are providing direct hunger relief. But then over a few years, we came to see that to deal with hunger and malnutrition, one has to address also the underlying roots of hunger and malnutrition. And the sort of what underlies hunger and malnutrition, first at one level is poverty.
Sure.
And what maintains poverty in many countries and communities is the subordinate status of women and girls in these traditional societies. So we found that a very effective remedy for poverty is to promote the education of girls and to provide women with the opportunity to start right livelihood projects to support their families.
Oh.
And so we have 4 basic ways now in which we address hunger and malnutrition. The first is direct food aid.
Mm-hmm.
The second is supporting the education of girls.
Okay.
We have girls in India, Cambodia, Nicaragua, Peru, Bangladesh, supporting their education so that they can, and Sri Lanka, so that they can, get jobs and then earn more.
Sure.
So that's the second modality, supporting education of girls and enabling women to start right livelihood projects. And then the fourth, which a little bit overlaps with the third, and this is sort of our way of dealing with the ecological crisis, is to supporting projects that utilize ecologically healthy and sustainable methods of agriculture.
Okay.
That don't rely on heavy use of fossil fuels and high technology.
And your 4 interventions are very, I guess, in the Buddhist approach, that when we deal with dukkha, we don't just do it on the surface, but we look for the roots.
Exactly, yeah.
And it's a very logical and rational way of dealing with suffering in the macro level or micro level.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and it's a beautiful way to demonstrate how we all can do a little something for self and others. How do we motivate people to do more of this? Do we have to be Buddhists? I mean, how do you motivate people to join your Buddhist Global Relief?
Yeah, first, I don't want to sort of insist that people have to support exclusively Buddhist Global Relief.
Of course.
But what I think what we all have to do, whether one is Buddhist or non-Buddhist, is to see that all human beings are fundamentally, in their essence, the same, that we all want the same things, that we all want to live, to thrive, not to face illness, oppression, disease, not to have to deal with a constant day-to-day struggle just to survive, to be faced with premature death. And so if we reflect on this common nature of all humanity, and we reflect on it somewhat deeply, it should just naturally arouse a sense of compassion in the heart and drive a sense of responsibility, a willingness to take responsibility for the well-being of others, the well-being of the world. Then I'd say, once you develop that altruistic or compassionate intention, then find something specific that really motivates your heart. Something that you could contribute according to your own means, whether it's financial assistance or your own ability, either by volunteering or by seeking some kind of employment in that area, but make an active commitment to promote the well-being of others, the safety and security of others.
Sure.
And that is not only, when you're doing that, you're not only benefiting others, but when you reflect back on what you're doing, that gives you a sense of joy, fulfillment, and meaning in your own life.
And a sense of a healthy self.
Yeah.
Right. And So would you say that our hope is that when people are interested, let's say in mindfulness, the secular meditation, of course, at first is to deal with our own stress and suffering, but hopefully from this practice they can develop some kind of empathy to
Exactly.
see the
Yeah.
interconnectedness,
Yeah.
to see that we're all brother and sister in some
Yeah.
way. So not just doing mindfulness, but mindfulness in action, that we're not just the sitting Buddha, but we all can be the walking Buddha.
Yeah, that's expressed very, very well. In fact, you use that expression, the walking Buddha. You know, Dr. Ambedkar, who is the one who spearheaded the Buddhist revival in India, specifically requested when people wanted to make a Buddha statue for him, he said he doesn't want a statue of the Buddha sitting with his eyes closed in meditation, but he wants an image of the Buddha walking. And so they made a statue of the Buddha walking. And now there's a center in India, in Nagpur, India. It's called Nagaloka.
Okay.
And at the center of Nagaloka is a kind of training center for the Ambedkar Buddhists to train them in Buddhism. So at the center of Nagaloka is this large statue of the walking Buddha.
Sure.
And I visited there in the year 2019, and I gave some teachings there. And then as a parting gift, they gave me a small statue of the walking Buddha.
Well, and I'm very glad to meet you because you are a true example of walking Buddha among us.
A walking monk.
A walking monk. Well, I personally enjoyed very much of our conversation. I learned a lot from you. Any final words you have for our audience?
Well, I think my final words, maybe there comes to mind a saying of the Buddha in the Satipatthana, in his collected discourses on Satipatthana, on the practice of mindfulness. He says, protecting oneself, one protects others. Protecting others, one protects oneself. Then he raises the question, how is it that protecting oneself, one protects others? And then the answer, he says, by practicing the 4 foundations of mindfulness. So through the 4 foundations of mindfulness, you develop your own higher qualities, your own wisdom, your own insight. You help to overcome the tendencies towards greed, hatred, and delusion. And so you're protecting yourself, and in that way, you're indirectly protecting others. But then he raises the question, how is it that protecting others, you protect yourself? And then the answer he gives, through developing harmlessness, patience, kindness, and compassion.
Mm-hmm.
So when we develop those qualities are more directly directed towards others, towards protecting others from harm and suffering. But in doing that, we also protect ourselves. Of course, we're safeguarding our own minds, our own hearts from the tendencies towards violence and harmfulness.
That is a beautiful way of concluding our conversation. Thank you so much for your time and teaching.
And thank you for having me.
And I hope you enjoy our conversation. If you're interested in mindfulness, remember, don't just be mindful, but be mindful in action. We're not just the sitting Buddha, but we're the walking Buddha as well. So every month, 3rd Friday, stay tuned.